Live now, Lisa?
We are live.
We are.
Welcome,
okay.
everyone.
Awesome. Good morning and welcome to the new Open Air Guidelines webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm Annie McGrath, the Executive Director at the Washington Brewers Guild, and we're so pleased to be co-hosting this webinar with our very good friends, the Washington Hospitality Association, represented today by their Senior Manager of State Government Affairs, Samantha Louderback, and the Washington Wine Institute, represented today by the Executive Director, Josh McDonald. Samantha and Josh, can you give a wave so we know where you're at? Thank you. I hope that everybody on here knows how hard these two and everyone at your associations have been working on your behalf. And I know I've really appreciated the partnership during this extremely challenging time for our industries. Some housekeeping before we get started. Below on your screen, you're going to see the chat button. Please feel free to say hello in there so we know who's out there. And we know that there are a lot of questions on this topic, and we're going to encourage you to not be shy and use the Q&A button for those. And we'll be monitoring the Q&A feature as we go along. I'd also like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available online after the event. Today, we'll go through each of the 4 open air concepts one by one. The Department of Health will provide an overview of each concept, followed by some insight from the Liquor and Cannabis Board on what to expect with licensing and enforcement. And Labor and Industries will be available to provide additional clarity on some of the more technical aspects related to the different concepts. Please send in your questions as they come up, and we will try to get as many answered as we can today. Josh, would you like to introduce our panelists?
Yes, thank you, Annie. Again, really appreciate that. And again, I also appreciate the partnership here with our colleagues and friends in the Washington Brewers Guild and Washington Hospitality Association, as well as our state agency partners that we've worked with over the course of 2020 through the entire pandemic, and now on these guidelines specifically to help our members in our industries as we work through 2021. Today, we are excited to have a great lineup of panelists from agencies charged with overseeing the new guidelines. Also, they also were part of our coalition working on the guidelines themselves. So we want to thank them for that partnership as well to what we have today. With us today from the Department of Health is Susan Shelton and Joe Graham. And from Liquor and Cannabis Board, Chief Justin Nordhorn, Customer Service and Support Manager Beth Lehman. From Labor and Industries, we have Ryan Allen and John Stebbins. And from the Office of Governor Inslee, Senior Policy Advisor, we have Sherry Sawyer. So thank you all so much for being here with us today and for the work that has gone into developing these new options. But now I'm going to hand things over to Susan Shelton with the Department of Health, who will take the lead on walking us through the guidelines today. Remember, be sure to add your question in the Q&A box, and we'll work to get them answered for you. Susan, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Josh, and everyone. Hopefully you can see the slide set today. We're going to talk quickly about a little bit of introduction for the open air and outdoor dining guidance, and then we will start with open air concept 1. So I do want to throw out a great thank you to everyone that's on the panel and all of the industry association partners that we've had. It really was a very concerted effort to make sure we could provide some additional options. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at the document. It's posted on the governor's website, so please make sure that you're always keeping an updated version. Again, it's on the governor's website for the business and workers guidance pages. It's a 2-page document. It covers quite a few new items. We're going to call them open air concepts. We have them grouped into open air concepts 1 through 4. So we'll introduce those and we'll talk about those more in depth as we go along with today's presentation. We were really trying to work carefully together to make sure we weren't stricter than previous requirements while still adding a couple of additional allowances. So again, we'll cover those as we go forward. It does require an open window or door. I think a lot of your questions might be regarding, can we just increase HVAC? Can we just modify our air intake and our filtration or something along those lines? These open air guidance requirements actually do require an open window or door. We're going to call them permeable walls, and we're going to talk about that more in depth. It also does not replace other COVID-19 transmission prevention. So we're still going to have distancing requirements in there. So you still have to have seating tables 6 feet apart. We still want to make sure that people are wearing their face covers when they are walking around your facilities. So it's really key. The virus can still spread when people are actually just sitting and talking. And so if they're just sitting and talking, they're supposed to still have a face cover on. It's when they're ordering from your servers, we want to make sure they still have a face cover. So again, the face cover shouldn't come off until they're actually eating or drinking inside the facility, and also when they're seated. And then the last part is making sure that we're still keeping up with the sanitation. You know, if you start bringing people into your environment, again, we're going to need to make sure that we're still doing the cleaning and sanitizing so that we can help reduce the risk of transmission of the virus. So let's cover real quickly page 1. It's got quite a bit of narrative. It explains some of the introduction, talks about what the permeable walls are, the different open air concepts. And I'd like to highlight a few items in particular. One of the first, in the first couple of paragraphs, it talks about how to work with your local building codes, your local health jurisdiction, Liquor Cannabis Board, Labor and Industries, your other partners. So again, we really want to encourage you to review these guidance materials or the requirements very carefully, see how it does apply to your structure. And then if you have questions or if you need to make a modification, really reach out to your local partners. They can also assist, you know, to help you to see if you can make these, if you can fit these requirements. The permeable walls we'll talk about, but it's going to be, a permeable wall is going to be a wall that can be opened with either a window, a door, a screen, open tent flap. It's going to be an actual opening inside the structure perimeter. All right, so again, people have been asking quite a bit about, can I just modify my HVAC? And the answer is no, you actually have to have an openable window, door, screen, something along those lines. Also, one thing we'll be talking about quite a bit today in open air concepts 1 and 2, we actually do require some carbon dioxide monitoring. So we'll be talking about that quite a bit as well, because we're getting questions on the CO2 monitoring. Also, open air concepts 1 and 2 require you to open doors and windows 10 minutes before and after your customers leave. So when they're in there, you have to open it 10 minutes before they arrive, and then 10 minutes after. You have to make sure that your facility continues to air out. And when we talk with people and they're starting to do some of the monitoring, they do see a difference. So when your area has been closed up overnight, you know, you don't have maybe the HVAC fully going, you don't have staff in there, it still will have some levels of carbon dioxide. So we want to make sure you open up all of those areas as much as possible before you actually have your customers come inside. And again, it's also very key once they leave that you continue to let the facility air out to remove as much of the carbon dioxide as possible. So let's talk about why we're looking at carbon dioxide. And sometimes people are confusing it with carbon monoxide. So we wanted to clarify the differences between the two real quickly. So again, these are compounds that we have in our environment. We wanted to cover just a couple of few basics. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, tasteless. It's lighter than air. So that pretty much means it's less dense than air. So if you're monitoring for it, you usually put a monitor up pretty high. It's a flammable gas. Compared to carbon dioxide, which is also colorless. It's also odorless at low concentrations. Once it gets in higher concentrations, you can actually start to smell it. It's going to smell acidic, but that's at high concentrations. It's heavier than air. So your monitors for carbon dioxide should be lower. They should be about where people are breathing, that type of height. And it's a non-flammable gas. The source for carbon monoxide, it's incomplete combustion and improperly ventilated fuel burning equipment. So you probably have carbon monoxide monitors inside your homes and inside your businesses because of the fuel burning appliances that you have. So whether you have a propane heater, a gas stove, those are characteristics of items that we monitor for carbon monoxide in an indoor environment. You'll hear us sometimes talking about an orange flame. That's indicating of an incomplete combustion. A gas flame should be burning blue. So if you see an orange flame, we think that's incomplete combustion, probably going to increase the risk of carbon monoxide. Compared to carbon dioxide, it's a byproduct of animal respiration. So it's something that's released whenever we breathe. It's caused by fermentation, which I know a lot of you on this line are familiar with fermentation and how it can produce carbon dioxide. It's also a byproduct of combustion of fossil fuels and wood. A complete and clean burn combustion will actually have a blue flame, and that can still give off carbon dioxide. So we're not trying to totally scare you about these products. Carbon monoxide does have some usage. If you're working in food service and you know you have some of your meats that come in modified atmosphere packed, so they're sealed. Sometimes they will seal that with carbon monoxide. It'll bond to the blood, actually the heme inside of meat, and it will keep it red. All right, so there are sometimes that we use carbon monoxide in food. It's used in medicines, lasers, fuel, chemical industry. Similarly, we use carbon dioxide in food. We also use it in fire extinguishing, medicines, refrigeration. So we have quite a few uses for each of these products. Carbon monoxide generally targets a wide spectrum of your body if you're exposed to it. It goes for the lungs, your blood. It can bond and bind into your blood, which is why it's can be quite life-threatening. It also goes for your central nervous system compared to carbon dioxide, which the primary target organs are going to be your respiratory system. So while carbon monoxide isn't generally something that is naturally present, it's more of a sign of something that we've done with our environment, whether it's something we're producing. But we will have average levels, and these numbers are from the Department of Ecology. So in homes with gas stoves, they will have an environmental level of low levels with gas stoves are about 5 parts per million. High levels when they have gas stoves that aren't functioning properly are going to be closer to 30 parts per million. Compare that to carbon dioxide. Ecology estimates about 410 parts per million for outdoor average throughout the state of Washington. Again, that's an average. We'll have some places that are higher and some places that are lower. OSHA also has some exposure limits. Again, it's both of these gases can cause effects in people. Generally, it's going to be very low for carbon monoxide. It's one of the reasons why I think you've heard quite a bit about monoxide and had monitors inside your facilities, because the exposure limits are going to be about 50 parts per million for OSHA. And then carbon dioxide is quite a bit above that. It's 5,000 parts per million. And then they both can be life-threatening, but again, the primary concern for life-threatening is going to be with carbon monoxide compared to carbon dioxide. So again, we want to just really be clear that we want you to be aware of both of these. They're both important to your safety and your staffing. Carbon monoxide, in particular when you have combustion type of equipment like gas burning stoves and such. And then carbon dioxide, we're going to be watching for your air quality just to make sure you have enough transfer of indoor air with outdoor air. Because again, what we're looking for when we're doing this portion with open air concept, we're going to be monitoring how much people are actually breathing inside your facilities. Because again, that's one of the ways we can spread the virus that we're so worried about. So again, we're going to be watching that. We're going to use carbon dioxide as a proxy to estimate how many people are in there breathing and how much we're replacing the fresh outdoor air. So as you go through and you start looking, if you're going to do the carbon dioxide monitoring, you want to make sure we covered a few concepts with you. The relationship between carbon dioxide and infection risk is complex. You can't just look at a carbon dioxide number and know if you're going to have the potential for having illness. It's going to depend on if you have people in there that are actually infected, how long everybody's in the room, the type of activity. So one of the reasons why we're still making sure that we are seated when we're eating, we're not having a lot of activity going on, because as you start to exhale more, you increase your risk of transmission. So again, just some bullet items there on the left, you can see just to give you an idea, again, of some comparisons. So we estimate about 400 parts per million for outdoor levels for CO2. When people breathe, if it's in a contained breath, you're going to have about 40,000 parts per million. That's going to get dispersed in the environment, right? As you're breathing, it's going to continue to go out into the area. And as you start, your HVAC works, you have your doors, windows opens, you start having some wind, it's going to start to dilute that. So around 800 parts per million, what we would estimate is about 1% of the air you're breathing has already been breathed by someone else in that space. So again, we're trying to make sure we're going below that so that we can actually make sure we're having very little of the air that's actually been breathed by someone else to help reduce the risk. Another concept with carbon dioxide, one of the reasons why we use it as something to monitor is it creates a steady state. And so what that means then is it'll be inside of an environment, and as long as all of your variables stay the same, so you don't have additional wind that changes, you don't have more people coming into your room, you don't change the activity that they're doing, then the numbers should stay pretty consistent. And what that's going to allow you to do is it's going to allow you to adjust to go, okay, I need to have fewer people in here because my numbers are still a little bit too high, right? Or I need to open up another window because I need to have a little bit more fresh air interchange. Or I need to add a little bit of a convection. I need to add a fan or something to help, reduce or to help encourage more ventilation. So again, it's one of the reasons why we use carbon dioxide as a monitor. And then the other thing, your HVAC filters are going to remove some of the aerosols. They're not going to remove CO2. And so it's really going to give us an estimate of what's going on actually with the people that are breathing inside your space. So what I've got here on to the right is a screenshot of what you might see if you use an app-based kind of monitoring system. And we wanted to point this out because we are really shooting for carbon dioxide levels that are very close to outdoor air. When we usually do indoor air quality, we want to make sure you have good air interchange. We usually look for between 600 parts per million to 1,000 parts per million. So these pieces of equipment that you use are probably going to tell you this is good. These numbers are great. They're 600, 700, 800, but we're like, no, you have to go lower than that. Okay, so I can't have you just look at this thing and say, well, it says I'm good. You have to look here in the middle number where it says CO2 443. That's the number that we're going to start really focusing on. All right, so again, you can't just look at it and say, well, it says I'm green. I'm like, we have to go a little bit better than what your monitors probably say is going to be good. Okay, because again, we're trying to reduce the risk of the virus, not just make sure that you have some air interchange inside your facility. Okay, so then again, page 2, just to walk you through the document, we cover some unique requirements for open air concept 4. Most of you are going to probably think of those as the pods, the small group enclosures that we have. Again, those are going to be limited to 1 seating group, 6 or fewer people. You have to hopefully you can keep staff out of there. And again, this one has a requirement to make sure you air them out after the dining group leaves before you actually do the cleaning and sanitizing. Again, we really want to limit employee access inside of those facilities when they actually have customers, because you don't have a lot of air interchange inside those small structures. And we really want to make sure that you're keeping staff out as much as possible. So the best part, and probably the best concept of this document that I think is going to probably be the most helpful is the chart down on the bottom of page 2. It's a chart with the schematics, detail each of the open air concepts. So it has a small little map there to help you kind of visualize the space. And then it has additional materials and concepts about features, the type, whether it's indoor or open air, or a description of what else is going to be required for that space. So again, I think the chart on the bottom of page 2 is going to be very helpful. As we go through this, you'll see the schematics have some pretty consistent functions. So you'll see that there's a blue line that goes around. That's what we call a non-permeable wall. So that's going to be a wall that does not have a window that can open. That might be a sheet of glass. It could be a brick wall. It doesn't have a door inside of it. So it's going to be what we call a non-permeable wall. You'll also see blue circles. Really want to emphasize this concept that you're still going to be held to having no more than 6 diners at each table. And these table seatings still need to be at least 6 feet apart. So what you'll see is some locations, these are just generalized locations, where sometimes we're also going to have what's the 25% capacity. And so in this image that we're showing right now with the arrow pointing to it, you'll see that this has full capacity. Whereas when you look at open air concept 1, you'll see that there are fewer tables sitting around that space. So again, we're really trying to indicate that you also have to sometimes watch your capacity inside the facility as well. And then the target icon. So on a few of them, you will see a target icon, and that indicates that there needs to be carbon dioxide monitoring and a generalized location for where to put the meter. So I want to cover quickly indoor. Indoor indicates that they have probably at least 3 exterior walls that are impermeable. You don't have a window that you can open and additional doors. And so this is going to be what we would consider indoor dining. It's going to be prohibited in current phase 1. It won't be opened again until phase 2. So again, this is going to be indicated it has no permeable walls, except for you might have 1 access door that it goes to the exterior. Here's an example. Again, these are plate glass windows. They aren't operable, so this one would not be able to be used under the current guidance for open air concepts. All right, this is indoor dining. It would be closed until phase 2. good for takeout, good for delivery, other options, but not for open air dining at this point. So let's talk about open air concept 1. This is probably going to affect the widest variety of operators. So these would indicate that we have 1, 2, or 3 walls that are permeable. All right, so you have multiple fully open doors, windows, bay windows, bay doors. You have some sort of conglomeration that we can have multiple openings that can allow outdoor air into the facility. So this one though, because the air circulation is decreased, you don't necessarily have cross ventilation where you have opposing walls that are completely open. This is one, open air concept 1, you would need to use the carbon dioxide monitoring. And again, this one, you would have the maximum capacity of 25%. I want to be clear on that too. It's per structure. We've had some questions about that. Like if you have 2 tents outside, it's not, or 2 tents or two rooms that could fit this, it's 25% per room, not 25% total for that entire facility. So that's the introduction to open air concept 1. So let's look at a couple of pictures. So on the left panel, you'll see there's a room that's pretty much got one side that they can open up. It's got a bifold kind of accordion window system that they can open wide. Because it doesn't have the cross ventilation, this would need CO2 monitoring and again would be considered open air concept 1. Now the facility on the right is also going to be open air concept 1. And this one might be a little bit more difficult to see, but if you look closely, you can tell that several of the windows along the side are actually open and able to be kept open. So let's look at that facility a little bit more on the right. So here's the indoor shot of that facility. So again, this would be considered open air concept 1. It doesn't have cross ventilation because we don't have similar windows on each side, so they're not on opposing sides. So this one would require carbon dioxide monitoring to make sure that the levels were staying below 450 parts per million. Here's another example. So this one might be difficult to be able to tell, but the windows that are along the left that face out to the water actually are open. Those do not have panes of glass. So that is actually open space. It's pretty protected. In general, it does have, an overhead cover. It's got carpeting. You could tell it's pretty resistant to water inside there. So it is an enclosed space. But because it has that at least one side of openable windows, then that would be considered open air concept 1. So again, because it doesn't have the cross ventilation, this would also need the carbon dioxide monitoring. Here's another classic example. It's a facility that has bay doors. Again, they have a couple of bay doors that they can open. They also have the interior and exit door that they can also use. In this case, it's the bay doors that give them the opening or the ability to do open air concept 1. So they would need to open those, and because it doesn't have cross ventilation, they would still need to monitor the carbon dioxide inside the facility. And one final picture for open air concept 1. So this is an outdoor area. It's an outdoor patio. It has an outdoor cover. This, before they put the side panels up, would probably have qualified as outdoor dining, what we would consider open air concept 3. But because of the side panels, now it's become open air concept 1. And so that's an idea for everyone to consider. As they start putting up wind blocks or other areas, they might need to start monitoring the carbon dioxide values inside that facility. So I would estimate open air concept 1 would probably generate the most questions.
We sure do have a lot. I wasn't sure though if anyone from L&I wanted to jump in on any of the guidance before we started asking questions, or would you like to wait until questions are answered or asked?
I think that was well done, and we're happy to just answer questions whenever we're ready.
Great. So let's get started. So there have been a lot of questions around the CO2 levels being elevated above the 450 parts per million outside externally from the building, which means getting 450 parts per million inside the building is going to be a challenge. How are operators supposed to comply with that when the outdoor air is already above the limit?
So we have gotten some information, and ourselves here at LNI, as well as DOH, Department of Health, have had some discussions about these issues, and we're looking at that internally to figure out the best method to move forward for those areas where we are recognizing, such as like Spokane and Seattle area, where there might be more background levels to contend with. And so we're looking at that, and we want to make sure that we provide flexibility, but it's a discussion that we have just started and we're looking into. We do have at LNI free and confidential consultation services that could come out and provide assistance. It could be a setup issue, it could be another CO2 source issue that isn't recognized. So having somebody with some professional expertise on site might be enough to help out in that situation. But we're continuing the discussion as well for those areas.
Great, thank you. We've definitely heard a lot of questions and concerns around that from across the state, so we appreciate your work on that. Susan, I think there are some questions around permeable walls and non-permeable walls. What defines a door? What defines a window? Can an entry door be included in one of those openings on a permeable wall? Could you walk us through what 1, 2, or 3 walls means, and fully opened windows or bay doors? I think there are a lot of questions around. You have a 4-foot window, and the window unfortunately only opens 2 feet because that's the slider. Is that considered a fully open window? I think there are some questions around that.
Yeah, so we were trying to figure out a way to make it something that everyone could look at their facility and it would be like, okay, I have windows here that can actually open. And so the way I'm going to show that, though, is by introducing quickly open air concept 2. So some of you will have facilities that actually have bay doors that can fully open. And so that entire area will have fresh air that can go back and forth across. It'll have what we call cross ventilation. All right, anything less than that is going to keep us in open air concept 1. And so if you have, it doesn't matter necessarily the size of the window, okay? If you have, I know some restaurants I've seen, they've replaced their plate glass windows with like a window that just is a double hung window that they can just pry up. And so that's probably only maybe, a 2x2 space. That probably isn't going to won't allow as much as a bay door, but we're not trying to put it on how much of your window that you can actually open. It's just that you were incorporating outdoor air. What's going to happen is if your windows are pretty small, then the performance standard is going to be the parts per million. If you are using, then if you have a small window and you only have a couple of them, then it's going to be difficult for you to have many people in there because you're not going to have a lot of outdoor air coming in. That's what's going to be the standard that we're going to do. You have to open the windows as much as you can, right? So if you have a small window that only opens 8 inches, it's like that's as much as you can open it. And then you have to, so we're trying to making sure people are opening as much of their outdoor air as they can. And then on top of that, you're gonna have to monitor to make sure that you can actually maintain the 450 parts per million. So you've introduced the outdoor air by opening your exterior wall, and then you're also monitoring to make sure that you can keep the levels below 450 parts per million when you have people in there. So again, we're trying to set it as a performance standard.
Susan, thank you so much for that, because I think a lot of the questions that we're finding in the Q&A box are specific to people's floor plans in their business. And so I kind of want to stop there just for a second, because I know that's the question that we're getting the most at the Brewers Guild from our members is, we're not necessarily talking about the size of the opening, but that one of your walls needs to have an opening that's introducing enough fresh air into what would have otherwise been considered an indoor premise before this guidance came out. and that they're really going to be wanting to look at that that ppm level to make sure that they're getting enough airflow in that space to meet that open air one criteria. Is that correct?
It's exactly correct. So the dynamics, whenever you have indoor air quality, and I'm sure when you talk to people that help you with the HVAC, they're like, oh, there's all these different, it's engineer level. You know, if we were to try to go, how much of the change are we going to actually be able to make by how much air that comes in? It's going to depend on how much wind that you have in your area. You know, it's just so dynamic that we really can't decide or can't put on paper to determine if you have this much space, then you're going to have capacity. You know, it's going to have to be like, okay, open up as much as you can, but then use this parts per million, your CO2 monitor, to try to see, okay, do I have enough outdoor air coming in and interchanging? So you're exactly correct, Annie.
Thank you for that. And I know I also saw in the Q&A there, I think there might be a little bit of confusion because prior to these new guidelines coming out on January 11th, I think, there were some businesses that had talked with local health and had reached out to the LCB because they had a roll-up door. Prior to the 11th, that wasn't allowed, and any permanent structure was still considered indoor. So I would also just encourage anybody who may have reached out to the LCB or their local health jurisdiction prior to January 11th. These are new guidelines. And so even if you had been told before that that was not going to meet the criteria for outdoor dining, that may very well have changed on January 11th. I did see that issue kind of popping up in the Q&A as well.
It was a huge paradigm shift for, I think, all of us. And it did come about pretty quickly, you know, and work with the governor's office. And so we had when that guidance changed and when it came through, we were trying to update people and inform them because it was a paradigm shift. So yes, a lot of the structures that we had previously where it didn't meet the allowances do now. And so really want to make sure people are revisiting their structures.
Yeah, Susan, just real quick, I'd like to jump in and say, so if you were denied before based on the old guidelines, make sure you reach back out to us. Please reach back out to us because we're willing to look at that again and approve it based on the new guidelines. Thanks.
Great. That answers a lot of questions in the chat, as well as who helps approve these plans. I think also just for the group, we're getting a lot of specific questions for your specific operation. I think that you should look at each open air option and concept, and what you see on the screen for open air concept 1, I would identify as the floor of the requirements. You must meet all of the things on the screen to comply with open air option 1. If you'd like to add a ceiling fan to get more airflow or a fan in your facility, absolutely go ahead. But just note that the things here that you're seeing on the screen are at least the floor. Of course, opening more windows and adding more airflow in there is never going to be told you can't do it. The more airflow, the better. I think one question that we're getting a lot of, and I'm not sure who'd like to answer this, is what CO2 monitors would you recommend?
So there's a number of different CO2 monitors on the market. Without having done the research to break down all the differences, I will say that we're looking for something that is a direct reading instrument. You'll see a lot of concepts as data logging and different things like that you may not need for your environment and what you're dealing with and the purpose of your monitor here, but just something that can provide you a direct measurement that you find easy to maintain based on the manufacturer's instructions. That would be my recommendation. And I know John Stebbins is on the line as well, if he has anything else to add with that as well.
No, we're just looking for something that's continuous monitoring with a direct reading, and we haven't done evaluations of individual monitors at this point.
So I'll throw out too, you'll be surprised at where you'll find them. A lot of people use them to monitor carbon dioxide levels in a greenhouse. So they're trying to push for high levels of carbon dioxide. So they're pretty widely available. I think you want to look for something that's an infrared. I know that's it's a infrared, uses an infrared system. Generally, they're going to be in the $100 to $150 range to get one that's probably going to meet what L&I is talking about.
And the ones that are marketed for indoor air quality or greenhouse use are probably good. There are some that are marketed for safety purposes, and they actually alarm at a much higher level and may not be sensitive at the levels that we need for this.
Yeah, I think that's really key, because if you are using one from a greenhouse, they're going to be, they want levels in the 1200 parts per million range, you know, for carbon dioxide. And you want to make sure that it's going to meet the range that you're looking for, which is going to be down in the 450 parts per million.
Susan and panelists, we're getting a lot of questions around approval and those kind of things. As associations for our members and industry, we've been encouraging everyone to go directly to your local health officer, local LCB officer to talk through your concept and your specific setup. And that's what we've tried to do to kind of make sure that everyone's on the same page and can get the tools they need to be able to do this if it works for them. Could you talk a little bit about that from both the Liquor and Cannabis Board side as well as the Torrent Health side on that process?
I can talk about it on the Liquor and Cannabis side. So the process is you go to our website and you go to the alterations. You go to the licensing services, and then you go to the alterations application, and that application will give you instructions on what you need to fill out and send in to us. You can email it to us. Our turnaround time, our guys have been incredible about getting these done pretty darn quickly. I want to stress, I was going to do this during my little spiel, but I want to stress that if these are indoor areas that you have already had approval to operate in, that you just haven't utilized since you haven't been able to with the pandemic, you do not need approval from us for that. Those are already your dining rooms. And if you meet those requirements and can open, you can go ahead and utilize those. Please do not do an alterations request for those because it's not needed. You only reach out to us for approval if these are outdoor areas that you're constructing, and then fill out those alterations requests, email them into us. Our staff will reach out to you either the same day or in a couple of days, and we can usually get them done in probably 3 to 7 days, unless there's something different about it that we haven't seen before. And then sometimes we need to kind of do a management consensus on those ones. But the process is really easy. If you have any questions, please reach out to our customer service line, and they can help you and walk you through the process. But as far as the licensing side, that's what you need to do. And like I said, we are really turning them around as quickly as possible. So if you do end up seeing a lag on it, reach out, call the 1600 line and say, hey, I turned this in a few days ago, but I haven't heard from anybody. Don't hesitate to do that. And yeah, I think that's it. But reach out. But if you're having any problems, then reach out and ask for me directly if you want to.
It's similar from the public health side, where we're not looking for advance approval. We're just, we're here if you have questions, if you're like, okay, what about this? We're trying to, help as much as possible. Again, it's really on you making sure that you're able to follow these and monitor and make sure that you're doing all of the other requirements for dining. Like we mentioned earlier, the sanitation, the employee health monitoring, the masking or the face covers, all of that. But again, it's not required to have advance approval to begin one of these.
Susan, I think we should just ask a couple more questions and then move on. But one question we're getting a lot of questions around is bay doors. So, those big garage doors, they could be the length of height of your building. So 10, 14 feet. Do those doors need to be completely open? Because in the guidance, it does say fully opened. However, when you have a 14-foot wall, is the fully opened door appropriate or necessary?
Yeah, so I'm going to key back here into open air concept too. So if you want to have it partially open, right, that would be open air concept 1, and you probably, you need to continue to do the carbon dioxide monitoring. then you can adjust and say, okay, I have enough airflow for how many people I have in this space. We can appreciate it. We've had a lot of wind in the last couple of weeks that people are like, I can't have this totally open. But at the same time, then you need to monitor for the carbon dioxide. Now, if you're planning on doing what we call open air concept 2, which is the schematic we have showing here, those need to be fully open because you're not going to be doing the carbon dioxide monitoring. You're expecting full, complete interchange with outdoor air at this point. All right, so those you would have to have them open all the way up, because that should be just about as much interchange that you're going to have with outdoor air.
Just one last thing, I think, before we move on to option 2. And again, we can answer more questions at the end of this because I think we'll have more. We're getting a lot of questions around folks reaching out to local health jurisdictions, LCB officers, as well as L&I, and staff not necessarily being up to speed. So I just wanted to address that really quickly and say this came out fast and furious last week. We all saw it when it was finally released in its final version. So I understand the anticipation and excitement around this guidance, but if we could just give a little grace to our fellow partners within DOH, LCB, and L&I to get trained and up to speed on this new guidance, that would be super helpful. Again, if you are having issues with one of these agencies not understanding or maybe giving you, you think, the wrong direction, please reach out to your association. We are happy to help walk through the process on what needs to happen, or maybe there was a miscommunication, but just wanted to ask for some grace for our fellow partners.
I appreciate that. It was a very large paradigm shift. I know when we talked with a lot of operators early last week, they're like, is this legit? We're like, it's on the governor's website. And they're like, I still don't believe this yet. And so it was quite a change, I think, for all of us. And so, yes, I think we all need a little bit of grace, and it's a learning, concept that we're doing as well. This is novel pretty much for the US. And so we want to make sure that we're able to continue to make sure it's going to work for us also. So if possible, since we've come up to open air concept 2, we recognize open air concept 1 is going to have a lot of questions. I think they will start to reduce, but open air concept 2 is, again, going to indicate that you have at least 50% of your non-adjacent walls are open. So non-adjacent means they're opposite each other. So that's going to allow for as much cross ventilation as we can get inside that area. Again, this is matching what I think a lot of people considered outdoor dining before. So again, we're trying to keep it as consistent as possible with the original requirements. And so CO2 monitoring is not required if you're seated within the air pathway. So some of you might have permanent structures where you've got 2 bay doors on each opposing walls. And in that case, you can open those up and you wouldn't need to do CO2 monitoring if you've laid out your tables like we're showing in this image here. So the tables are only in between the actual bay doors that are open. Now, if you have a large facility, and so it just continues, and so you can see that in the red language down below, you have additional seats. Then if you're going to put seating in those areas, since they're out of the actual cross ventilation, you would need to use the CO2 monitoring in that area. And again, when we say that you put the monitoring area in that area, is you would put it around the dining area. You want it to be where the people are. And again, we talked about it earlier, CO2, you're going to want to monitor around the height of people, not up high, but down where they are actually sitting and breathing. So on a table around 5 feet in that general area is where you'd want to place the CO2 monitor. The other concept we want to bring up with this, it was a question that we got quite a bit with the previous guidance for outdoor dining, is what about if you're in a building that's next to another building? All right, so you'll see in the gray bar up at the top when you read through the schematic, it'll say that there are no barriers that exceed 4 feet in height within 10 feet of the seating area. So in this schematic here, if those doors that you see that are open on each of the sides, they would have to be at least 10 feet from a neighboring building or from a fence or something along those lines that are over 4 feet high. Okay, so if you have a block that's within 10 feet of those access doors, then you would actually need to do CO2 monitoring because you'd actually be open air concept 1. Okay, so this really relies on making sure that you don't have any block within 10 feet of those side walls that are what we call permeable. So those are my thoughts on open air concept 2. Show you the classic example is an outdoor dining tent. Has open air on both sides. The panels are fully moved so that you actually have as much cross ventilation going in between that unit as you can. That's an example of open air concept 2. And that what we see in the screen right here would not need carbon dioxide monitoring. I released the floor here, Samantha.
I think the only question I'm trying to answer questions so I'm not missing any for the next ones, but I'm seeing, is there a capacity requirement for open air concept 2? And I think that this question's come up a lot. So I think that would be fantastic if we could get that clarified.
And that might be something that we might have to follow back on, because I think part of we're trying to make sure that all of our documents, the Department of Health and working with our partners, align with the current governor's requirements and guidelines. And so I think there's a little bit, we're trying to make sure that all of those are grouped. And so I don't know that I have an answer for that one. If you're looking for my point, if anybody else on the panel can actually contribute to that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think we'd have to follow up. I know we weren't necessarily looking at specific capacity questions. So maybe we can discuss that internally and circle back and provide a response.
Yeah, we were so focused, I think, on making sure that we were allowing for the open air concepts. I don't want to misspeak and not have it meet the governor's requirements for phase 2 and other phases in particular. So I'll make sure those are aligned. We are working on that though.
That would be super helpful. I think just for our industries and what open air concept 2 looks like with pertaining to the last outdoor guidance, there was no occupancy required with these type of structures. And so a change to that would be a shift, as well as you already have to set tables 6 feet apart. So there is already an occupancy restriction a little bit around space and guidance, but just so you're aware.
Yeah. Well, and when you look at this document, you'll see that there aren't any capacity requirements here on this, but we just want to make sure that that's in alignment with the future phases from the governor's office.
Susan, just to kind of clarify or hammer the point on open air concept 2, you're talking about when you say 10 feet, you're talking about, so if you set up your tent close to your permanent building, you're saying you need that space between them to be at least 10 feet. Is that correct?
Correct, because that was a question that we got quite a bit. People were like, adjacent, how close? And so like 10 feet. And so in this case, it would be 10 feet, I'm sure, but for that open side, right? Not the side that's actually closed, yeah.
So a couple observations on this, and I'm sure there's going to be some additional questions as people get up and running and having their businesses open. So when you're looking at the open air concept 2, I want to encourage people to digest that diagram. So when you have the 2 full open cross ventilation across, as the questions pertained on capacity limitation, especially on the outdoor areas, yes, there wasn't anything designated, and it sounds like there's some clarification that we'll be seeking. But please look at that red line on the diagram. Because if you have a cove of some sort that is not within that cross ventilation section, it applies differently than where the seating is happening in that cross ventilation. So you can have a structure, especially if you're indoors, where you may have a section that's cross ventilated and then another section that has no cross ventilation. So those questions will continue probably to come up. We'll be trying to address those, but if you're putting tables and seating in those non-cross ventilated areas, there's probably going to need to be CO2 monitoring in those areas where it's not necessarily required in that full cross ventilation. So from an LCB standpoint, when we come in, we're going to be trying to be reasonable with what we're looking at. We're going to assess, is this an open air concept 1 or 2 or 3 or 4? And is there CO2 requirements? If so, we'll be looking at, okay, do you have them? Are they placed appropriately? We're going to be trying to provide as much education around that. That won't be our focal point of enforcement. But as we're out in these businesses frequently, we're going to be trying to get those. And I also wanted to reiterate something that Beth touched upon. If you are changing the whole physical structure as far as your liquor service areas for those with liquor licenses, that's where you would need their alterations request. If you are not changing your customer floor plan, you already have indoor or outdoor approval, you're not expanding that space, you may be moving tables and chairs around to create the separation and distance. You don't need to get prior approval. So you'd be able to adopt the appropriate open air concept depending on the phases that we're in for your areas. So keep that in mind, so you're not delaying your opportunity to have some operations and waiting for approvals. And I did see a question that while I'm on the topic, there's some concern about the consistency of oversight. We issue things like notices to correct and warnings if we're seeing things. We try to predominantly do education up front when there's any kind of change made. And for those folks who are concerned about violation notices or ticketing and that sort of thing, we already have systems in place that it's not officer discretion. Those are all run up through the chain of command. We're looking at these so we can be as consistent across the state as we can before approving any type of sanction against a business. So you're not having to be concerned about the pockets of the different parts of the state. That's all coming up through the administration to be able to do a full assessment on whether that's a reasonable application or not. So, and that's one of the reasons I think we're seeing so much success with the educational push and effort and so few violation notices per contact that's out there. So try to provide some certainty for folks, if we're seeing people operate in good faith, we're going to do our good faith effort in working with people up front and not being punitive in nature. This is not about shutting businesses down. This is about making sure that the safety of your employees and your customers are in place so people can be successful.
I think the most questions, Susan, that we're getting is a matter on open air 1 still, but also how I know that LNI offered a way that businesses can communicate with LNI to ask questions as well as the LCB. Is there any way you guys could drop that information or a link in the chat so folks could find those resources? We're getting a lot of questions on how to contact you after this.
Yeah, I can pull some information and share it for everybody to have.
I will as well.
Thank you so much. I think another question that we're getting a lot, Susan, is for your space, how many CO2 monitors do you need to have? Susan, you're muted, unfortunately.
She might have froze.
She might be frozen. So what was the question again? How many CO2 monitors would you need? Oh, looks like she's back.
Oh,
I apologize for that. I'm not sure what happened. It just all of a sudden blinked. So I apologize. So Ryan, did you want to complete that answer?
Sure. From my understanding, what we're looking at is just that you have a monitor, and depending on how many spots you might need to check, one monitor should suffice. I don't think we're looking at creating a 8-hour average. We just want you to periodically check areas where we require the monitoring to make sure that it's at the level that it needs to be, and that whatever is happening inside the location, number of people and activities or whatever's going on, that it's not elevating up to a level above that. So checking, early in the shift, checking when we are the most full, max whatever capacity is going to end up being, to make sure that the levels are holding steady, to understand how many people you can have in the space, because every space is going to be different and have its own dynamics. Some people may be able to have 10 or 15 people, and some people may be able to have more than that. And it's just a matter of one monitor should be fine to check those areas periodically throughout the day.
I think the other part of that, a lot of you might have one attached to your HVAC where it helps you modify how much outdoor air you're pulling in on a regular basis. We're not talking about that one. It has to be one that's actually dedicated to monitor your dining area and is located in your dining area. And like Ryan said, one works because these are relatively mobile. Most of them have a chargeable battery, so they can be moved around. They don't need to be attached to your wall. So it would be something that you could then move around, and kind of like what Chief Nordum was talking about, it's a good faith. We want to make sure that you're actually able to monitor your environment. So it's not that you just set it there and think it's good to go for the entire time. You would actually move it around and make sure that your airflow is working as designed. Again, we talked earlier that it's an odorless, colorless gas. And so you really do need to move it around so that you can actually see, because you really can't tell just by looking how the airflow is working inside the facility. You need to monitor it. So just having one is plenty, but you need to be prepared to move it around and actually do active monitoring on a basis so that you can see how it works when you have customers inside there.
I think it's fair to move on to the next concepts.
Okay. So this is Open Air Concept 3. Again, this was more just a clarifying so that people could see that it could have one side wall. We had a lot of questions with the earlier guidance from last year about, well, what if it's right next to a building? Does it have to be a certain distance away from the building? So Open Air Concept 3 would indicate you have no more than one sidewall that exceeds 4 feet in height. So that's what the blue line is here. That's indicating a sidewall that's more than 4 feet tall. And again, the vast majority of sides, all 3 of the other sides, have no sidewalls at all. So again, you have pretty much open air ventilation. It allows for rapid dispersal of droplets and aerosols. So there's no carbon dioxide monitoring that's required here. Classic example is an overhead cover over a structure that's attached or situated right next to the actual exterior of the facility. So this again would be considered Open Air Concept 3. It has an overhead cover. It has one side wall that does block wind, we recognize, but the other 3 perimeter proportions of the perimeter actually are not blocked. And so this would allow for sufficient airflow. So again, this was just as a clarification for Open Air Concept 3. One thing that we do want to make sure that we're all on the same page with, in this image, you'll see a pretty open framework fence around the perimeter. That could also be filled in. It could be brick, it could be wood. It's no taller than 4 feet, so that would not count as a barrier to the airflow. So again, a lot of facilities might have a security wall or some other kind of block that's about 4 feet tall. Again, that would not be considered a block, so that could be considered Open Air Concept 3, up to 4 feet. Any questions or additional thoughts from panelists on Open Air Concept 3? Okay, our final Open Air concept is Open Air Concept 4. And again, these are the small group structures such as igloos or pods. You'll see on the schematic that there's only one dining table. This is going to be limited to a group of 6 or fewer people at a time. Again, this one doesn't have HVAC inside those structures. They're reliant on having the door or window open. And so this one, the guidance, the current guidance allows the door or window to be closed when the dining group is in there. But when they are ready to leave, then the facility, the pod needs to be opened up as much as possible, aired out for at least 10 minutes, and then the staff can go in and clean and sanitize. Again, the keys for us on this one is because there isn't HVAC inside these structures, we are encouraging that staff don't go in when they're actually occupied. So, figuring out a different way to do your menu ordering or to do your delivery of the food, as much as possible to limit staff time inside of that structure. If they, when they do service these units, they are supposed to be wearing a disposable mask, something that fits for medium risk of transmission. So again, that's usually a disposable mask. And again, this one doesn't require CO2 monitoring. So classic examples are the igloo shapes, the smaller yurts that you might see out and about. And again, these are smaller parties up to 6 people. And that wraps up concepts 1 through 4.
For everybody, I want to emphasize for open air concept 4, we tried our best to not really change much of those from the previous guidance. I know a lot of my wineries were using these, or some wineries were using these igloos, and others very successfully. So it's very important to make sure that if your current setup was approved, that really nothing changed, and you can continue as long as you continue to follow the guidelines. So I want to emphasize that this one was one of those concepts that was, at least in our industry, seen more prevalent and being approved before the new guidance came out. And I know we work together as state agencies and industry to make sure we didn't go backwards on any of those. They should look about the same.
One of the changes that was made to this, and it was based on industry and stakeholder input, was the ability to diners to close that window or door when they were in it. You know, we recognize it was a little tough in the winter to be maybe out inside these areas. And so because it's a household group or a group that already has contact, then this current version allows for that door or window to be closed while the diners are in there. But again, it needs to be open when an employee needs to go in and service the pod. But yes, the rest of it is the same, other than it allows up to 6 people.
So I think I'm checking out the questions, and I think that they are kind of repeats of earlier around outdoor air quality and not being able to meet the internal air quality. I think we've answered those. And just in order to save everyone's schedule, though, we've asked to join us today. We are over the hour limit that we asked for your time, so we appreciate that. I think at this point we should wrap up and work on getting this webinar in a link form so we can send out to all the registration or everyone who registered for this, and then let everyone go. Does anyone have any final thoughts that they'd like to share with our participants today?
So I just want to reiterate again that if you are not sure whether your concept is going to work or not, please reach out to us. We are always willing to work with you before you even apply to see if it's something that will meet the guidance. So I left some information in the chat, some contact information, so please use it.
Thank you, Beth. We are going to send a follow-up email to everyone, and we will include all of that contact information. So I know that not everyone may have been able to grab that, but we will make sure it's accessible. So get ready for a lot of questions.
Well, on that note, I just want to, from all of us, from the hospitality industry, restaurants, and everybody in the association, to the Washington Wine Institute, to the Washington Brewers Guild, just want to thank all of our panelists today for being with us, taking time to help us, to help work with us on these open air concepts over the past several weeks to get them to where they are, and hopefully give our operators an opportunity to make some sales and to survive in as we go through phase 1. And then also thank you for being here today. Thank you for taking time with us today, answering questions, walking us through this. We hope this was incredibly helpful. But as all of our members here in industries, please reach out to your associations for any related questions, help with your concept setups, anything we can do to help as we figure this out together. As Susan said, this is a fairly paradigm shift from previous guidance, and we recognize that. We hope it's helpful, but we do recognize it's a lot of shift. So we're here to help, and we're all here together, working together to do our best. So with that, just thank you all, and have a great rest of your day, weekend, and we'll be continue to work on this and so many other things as we work through 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.